At exactly 4:17 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on April 2nd, 2025, Donald Trump signed Executive Order 12127, Liberation Day, he called it. The order invoked International Emergency Economic Powers Act authority to impose immediate tariffs on virtually every country that trades with the United States. Not the targeted tariffs of his first presidency, not the strategic trade barriers economists debate in academic papers. Universal tariffs averaging 47% across all imports from all trading partners, effective immediately. The timing was deliberate. Markets closed for the weekend. European trading hours still hours away. Asian markets already shuttered for the day. By the time global financial centers opened Monday morning, American customs officials were already collecting duties that would fundamentally alter the mathematics of international commerce. The executive order contained a single paragraph that redefined global trade. All foreign goods entering American commerce shall be subject to reciprocal taxation, reflecting the true cost of America's trade imbalance with hostile economic actors. The language was Trump's, but the strategy had been developing for months in classified National Security Council meetings. Not trade policy in any conventional sense. Economic warfare designed to fracture the global trading system that had governed international commerce since Bretton Woods. The objective wasn't better trade deals or balanced exchanges. The objective was forcing other nations to choose between access to American markets and participation in economic systems that competed with American interests. Within 72 hours, the cascading effects began to manifest across global supply chains optimized for efficiency rather than resilience. Walmart's procurement systems, designed to source products from the lowest cost global suppliers, suddenly faced input costs that made many imports economically impossible. A television manufactured in Vietnam for $89 now faced $47 in tariffs before reaching American consumers. Either Walmart absorbed the cost and eliminated profit margins, or they passed the increase to customers already struggling with inflation. But Walmart's challenge was microscopic compared to the systemic disruptions rippling through industries that had spent decades building integrated global supply chains. Boeing's 787 Dreamliner contains components from 43 countries. Each component now faced tariff calculations that transformed aircraft manufacturing from precision engineering into complex tax accounting. A wing section fabricated in South Korea, engines assembled in the United Kingdom, electrical systems integrated in Japan. Every international component triggered tariff obligations that added millions to aircraft production costs. The automotive industry faced even more severe disruptions. Modern vehicles contain parts from dozens of countries, assembled in sequences that assume frictionless border crossings and predictable transportation costs. Ford's F-150 pickup truck, marketed as America's best-selling vehicle, sources transmission components from Germany, electronic systems from South Korea, and raw materials from 14 different countries. Trump's tariffs didn't just increase manufacturing costs. They made existing supply chain configurations economically unsustainable. General Motors announced production shutdowns at 3 facilities within the first week, not because they lacked components, but because tariff obligations made continued production unprofitable at current pricing. Toyota delayed launch of their 2026 Camry model pending supply chain reconfiguration. Stellantis suspended investment in planned American manufacturing expansion. The tariffs intended to restore American industrial capability were destroying American manufacturing employment. But the domestic disruptions were minor compared to the international responses that began materializing as other governments calculated their options. China's State Council met in emergency session 18 hours after Trump's executive order, not to negotiate or protest, but to implement coordinated retaliation that would demonstrate the interdependence Trump claimed to reject. By Thursday morning, Chinese customs authorities had suspended import permits for American agricultural products, frozen delivery schedules for American technology components, and initiated quality control reviews that effectively halted American exports to Chinese markets. The agricultural impact was immediate and devastating. American soybean farmers had cultivated relationships with Chinese buyers over decades, building supply chains that moved 60% of American soybean production to Chinese processing facilities. Chinese retaliation eliminated this market overnight, not through formal trade restrictions, but through administrative delays that made American agricultural exports economically impossible. Chinese importers found quality control problems with American soybeans. Shipping permits encountered bureaucratic processing delays. Insurance requirements changed without notice. Iowa farmers watching soybean prices collapse understood the mathematics of trade warfare better than the economists who had warned about tariff consequences. Global agricultural markets operate on thin margins and predictable demand, lose access to customers representing 30% of total production, and prices collapse across all remaining markets. Chinese retaliation didn't just affect farmers selling to China, it affected every American agricultural producer competing in global markets. The European Union's response was more sophisticated and potentially more damaging to long-term American interests. Rather than imposing retaliatory tariffs that would harm European consumers, European leaders announced accelerated integration with alternative trading partners, new bilateral agreements with South Korea, expanded partnerships with Japan, deeper economic cooperation with ASEAN nations. The message was clear. If America wanted to exit the global trading system, other countries would build alternative systems that excluded American participation. Germany's chancellor articulated the European strategy during an emergency G7 meeting called to address Trump's tariffs. America has chosen isolation over integration. Europe chooses partnership over punishment. The rhetoric was diplomatic, but the implications were revolutionary. The global trading system built around American economic leadership was fracturing along geopolitical lines. Countries were forced to choose between trading with America under punitive conditions or trading with each other under more favorable terms. The fracturing accelerated as countries implemented currency arrangements that bypassed dollar-denominated transactions. China and Russia expanded ruble-yuan trading mechanisms that eliminated dollars from bilateral commerce. India negotiated rupee-based energy purchases that reduced dependence on dollar liquidity. Brazil developed commodity exchanges denominated in regional currencies rather than dollars. Each bilateral arrangement represented lost demand for American currency and reduced influence for American monetary policy. Trump's team had anticipated some retaliation, but fundamentally misunderstood how modern economies would respond to systematic trade disruption. Their models assumed other countries would negotiate rather than adapt. Instead, governments began building alternative economic architectures that reduced dependence on American markets and American currency. The tariffs intended to strengthen American economic leverage were accelerating American economic isolation. The financial markets provided real-time assessment of Trump's trade strategy through price mechanisms that reflected actual economic consequences rather than political rhetoric. The dollar initially strengthened as import restrictions reduced demand for foreign currency. But as other countries developed alternative trading arrangements, demand for dollars and international commerce began declining. The Federal Reserve faced an impossible choice: maintain high interest rates to support dollar demand and crush domestic economic growth, or reduce rates to support American businesses and accept dollar devaluation. Meanwhile, American consumers discovered that tariffs are taxes paid by importers and passed to customers through higher prices. The washing machine that cost $400 in 2024 now costs $680. The laptop computer priced at $800 now required $200. The running shoes that retailed for $120 now sold for $180. Every imported product became more expensive, and domestic alternatives often didn't exist because American companies had moved production overseas decades earlier. The price increases hit hardest in regions that had voted most enthusiastically for Trump's economic nationalism. Rural communities that supported tariffs as protection for American industry discovered that agricultural equipment manufactured internationally became prohibitively expensive. Small towns that celebrated bringing jobs back to America found that the cost of consumer goods increased faster than local wages. The economic nationalism that promised prosperity delivered inflation instead. But the most devastating consequences emerged in industries where American companies depended on imported components for domestic manufacturing. The pharmaceutical industry faced massive disruptions as active pharmaceutical ingredients sourced from India and China became subject to tariff obligations that made generic drug production uneconomical. Medical device manufacturers found that specialized components essential for diagnostic equipment and surgical instruments faced prohibitive import duties. The technology sector experienced even more severe supply chain breakdowns. Semiconductor manufacturing requires hundreds of specialized inputs sourced from dozens of countries. Memory chips fabricated in South Korea, processors designed in Taiwan, assembly performed in Malaysia. Trump's tariffs didn't just increase costs. They made existing technology supply chains mathematically impossible to maintain. Apple announced delays for new product launches pending supply chain reconfiguration. Microsoft suspended plans for domestic data center expansion. Google postponed artificial intelligence infrastructure investments. The defense industrial base faced the paradoxical situation of needing foreign components to maintain American military superiority while facing tariffs that made such components economically prohibitive. Advanced fighter aircraft require rare earth elements processed in China, precision components manufactured in Germany, and specialized alloys produced in Japan. Pentagon procurement officers discovered that maintaining American military readiness required paying tariffs that funded the Treasury while undermining defense capabilities. By autumn 2025, the economic consequences were becoming politically unsustainable. Manufacturing employment was declining as companies shut down facilities made unprofitable by tariff obligations. Consumer prices were rising faster than wages as imported goods became more expensive. Agricultural exports were collapsing as other countries implemented retaliatory trade restrictions. The economic nationalism that promised to restore American prosperity was delivering recession instead. Republican lawmakers representing manufacturing regions began conducting economic assessments of trade policy outcomes as employment figures emerged from their districts. Agricultural state representatives received feedback from farming communities regarding tariff effects on rural economies. Republican governors in trade-active states initiated policy reviews to understand local economic trends better. The November 2025 midterm elections provided a referendum on Trump's trade strategy. Democrats gained control of the House of Representatives, campaigning on economic relief through tariff reduction. Republican senators in competitive races avoided mentioning trade policy while focusing on immigration and cultural issues. The electoral mathematics were clear. American voters supported economic nationalism in theory, but opposed the inflation and unemployment it delivered in practice. But reversing tariff policies proved more complex than implementing them. Supply chains optimized for global efficiency couldn't be quickly reconfigured for domestic production. Companies that had invested in alternative suppliers and new trading relationships weren't eager to rebuild connections with American markets that might face future trade disruptions. Countries that had developed bilateral trading arrangements excluding American participation weren't interested in returning to dollar-dominated commerce. The global trading system that had governed international commerce for 75 years was fragmenting into regional blocs organized around geopolitical relationships rather than economic efficiency. Asia-Pacific countries developed integrated supply chains centered on Chinese manufacturing and Japanese technology. European nations deepened integration while building partnerships with African and Latin American suppliers. American companies found themselves increasingly isolated from global value chains they had helped create. China emerged as the primary beneficiary of American trade isolation. While Trump's tariffs disrupted Chinese exports to American markets, they also accelerated Chinese efforts to develop alternative markets and reduce dependence on American consumers. Chinese manufacturers expanded production for domestic consumption while building new export relationships with countries eager to replace American suppliers. Chinese technology companies gained market share in regions where American competitors faced political restrictions and economic barriers. The irony was unmistakable. Trump's trade war, designed to contain Chinese economic expansion, was accelerating Chinese independence from American markets while isolating American companies from global growth opportunities. The tariffs intended to restore American manufacturing were making American products less competitive in international markets. The economic nationalism that promised to make America great again was making America irrelevant to global commerce. By early 2026, the consequences had become too severe to ignore. American GDP growth had slowed to recession levels as trade disruptions cascaded through the domestic economy. Inflation remained elevated despite Federal Reserve intervention as tariff costs passed through to consumer prices. Unemployment was rising in manufacturing regions that had expected to benefit from trade protection. The electoral coalition that supported Trump's economic nationalism was experiencing the economic consequences of that nationalism. Yet reversing course required acknowledging fundamental errors in economic strategy and accepting reduced American influence in global commerce. The countries that had developed alternative trading relationships weren't eager to return to systems dominated by American interests. The supply chains that had been disrupted couldn't be quickly restored. The international institutions that had facilitated global trade had been weakened by American withdrawal and wouldn't easily accommodate American re-engagement. Trump's tariff experiment had achieved something unprecedented in modern economic history. It had demonstrated that the global trading system could function without American leadership. Other countries had learned they could trade with each other, finance commerce and alternative currencies, and build supply chains that bypassed American markets. The dollar's role as the primary international reserve currency was being challenged by bilateral arrangements that eliminated the need for dollar transactions. The transformation was irreversible. Global commerce was reorganizing around regional partnerships and geopolitical alignments rather than economic efficiency and American leadership. Countries were choosing trading partners based on political relationships rather than market access. The liberal international economic order that had governed global trade since World War II was being replaced by economic blocs organized around strategic competition rather than comparative advantage. America's trade war had become America's trade isolation. The tariffs, intended to restore American economic dominance, had accelerated American economic decline. The policies designed to make other countries dependent on American markets had made American companies dependent on political protection rather than competitive advantage. The economic nationalism that promised to make America great again had made America irrelevant to the global economy that would define the next century of international relations. The lights were still on, the supply chain still functioned, the global economy still operated. But the architecture supporting international commerce had fundamentally changed. America was no longer the center of global trade. It was becoming a peripheral economy increasingly isolated from the growth and innovation driving global prosperity. Trump's Liberation Day had liberated the world from American economic leadership, leaving America to discover what international commerce looked like without American influence.